From Paris to Washington this morning, everybody's talking about Dominique Strauss-Kahn today. Joining us this morning, Jonathan Allen, senior congressional reporter for Politico. David Drucker is a staff writer for Roll Call. Guys, happy Friday. Good to see both of you. David Drucker, it says everybody's talking about DSK. Is that true in the Beltway today?
Well, I guess we'll find out as the morning unfolds. I don't think there's going to be much discussion of him here. It's a very interesting story, but it doesn't really play into Washington politics and what everybody's focused on here, which is the debt ceiling and economic matters.
Yeah, and I imagine maybe Geithner's taking a little bit of market share away from that today. But what is the sense about what's going to happen over the next 4 weeks?
Well, I think that's a great question. I tend to think that at the end of the day, at the 11th and a half hour, they're going to strike a deal to raise the debt ceiling, giving each side something to declare victory on. But the truth is, it's unclear because they're so far apart on the one issue that always trips up Democrats and Republicans, and that's tax increases or tax cuts. It's a huge political and emotional issue. It kind of defines what party you end up falling into these days, and right now, they're at loggerheads.
Jonathan, we had Corker on earlier in the week, and we asked him, I said, is this sort of outside of the realm of the way these negotiations generally go? And he said, you know, what's different is the clarity of the rhetoric, right, and the polarization of at least the chatter on both sides. Do you see it as being different in any significant way?
I think the big difference is the consequence. A lot of times when you have these big polarizing issues in Congress, it's just a matter of whether the government shuts down for a day or two. It's a matter of what programs get funded, which ones don't, a matter of social policy perhaps. In this case, you could have a world economic calamity if they don't get together. So while the feeling may be the same in terms of moving toward an 11th hour deal, the stakes are much, much bigger. And I think you're seeing that with the clarity of the rhetoric. I think you've got at least the president, you know, making his tough, hard stand for his political base, but understanding he doesn't really have the leverage because Republicans have something he wants, which is the votes to raise the debt ceiling, and to some extent they get to set the price on this.
Yeah, I wonder why, you know, some, David, say that it's not Republican versus Democrat this time, it's Democrat versus Republican, that there's two branches of the GOP that have very different views about how these negotiations should go. Is that the main dynamic that's complicating things?
I don't really think so. I think while in the Senate you might find a bit of a divergence of views among Republicans on how to proceed, I think at the end of the day what's really creating the problem here is the fact that Republicans don't expect to see a fiscal 2012 budget during which they might be able to get in the kind of reforms and spending cuts and other things they want. And so everything has become about the debt ceiling and the negotiations there. And simply put, in the House of Representatives and among, I'd say, 95% of Senate Republicans, there are no votes to raise taxes on the kind that Democrats really want. I think the president is probably a lot more flexible than Senate Democrats. The vote of House Democrats really don't matter because there's not enough of them. But at the end of the day, I'm wondering if the president is going to tell Senate Democrats, we have to take something we don't like. And I think kind of that's what it comes down to. But to assume that Republicans really don't believe in the position that they've taken philosophically, I think is a mistake. And I think that because they don't see any other avenue to get what they want fiscally, that's why everything is coming down to the debt ceiling vote.
Yeah. Jonathan, does the cancellation of the Senate recess make a difference?
Not at all. This is one of the biggest biggest misdirections in the world. There are about 3, maybe 4 members of Congress who matter to cutting a deal. All of them have very nice homes in Washington. They could be here even if the rest of the House and Senate, which, by the way, have done almost nothing legislatively this year, even if they were out for the July 4th recess. Harry Reid lives at the Ritz-Carlton. Nancy Pelosi lives on the waterfront. John Boehner's on Capitol Hill. Yeah. I mean, these guys are here if they need to make a deal. So I think that's one of the reasons you saw a big backlash from Congress yesterday about the lecture they got from the president. He's at a fundraiser last night. He's going to Martha's Vineyard for a couple weeks. Nobody's suggesting that he wouldn't be able to actually make a deal.
You got that right, or the number of golf trips. Can either of you guys explain why people on our air, at least, who watch markets and wonder how this is going to affect their portfolio say, oh, I think it's going to get done. It's an 11th hour thing, but it's going to happen. Where does that come from? And do you think it's a valid hope, David?
Well, I think that Congress always appears to be in this position where it can't happen, they're so far apart, and usually I find that the more they're sniping at each other and the farther apart they are publicly, the better chance you have for a deal, as long as they're still talking quietly and behind closed doors. I think people on the street are used to rational outcomes, and what they have to understand about Washington is there's so much emotion and value involved in political values as opposed to simply mathematics. But I think there's a certain rhythm to these things, and as you approach a deadline, it appears like nothing's going to happen, and then finally, because the stakes are high, as Jonathan mentioned, they find a way to get it done. Now, it doesn't always hold true, but I think it's not a wrong assumption to assume they'll get there.
Hey, Jonathan, you bring up a really good point. The president himself laid down the gauntlet with the Senate saying they shouldn't be out on break while we have this looming deadline. I completely agree with that, but can he then turn around and go to Martha's Vineyard?
I think it's not going to look good for him when he does it unless there's a deal in place. And let me just add something to what David said before. You know, everybody thought that a deal would get done on the bank bailout, and then they watched the House vote it down in 2008, and the Dow Jones Industrial
like 800 points
plummeted. So eventually a deal will get done on this, and if you're watching the markets, the smart thing is to know when, obviously, to buy and sell.
Yeah, if only every guest had the answer to that question, we wouldn't have much else to talk about. Guys, have a great 4th. Thanks for the insight.
Take care.
You too. Thanks for having me.